¿Qué tal, amigos? Hoy vamos a escuchar una entrevista de un hombre que se llama Peter Thiel, líder de una alianza rebelde de Hoover Institution, una de las figuras más prominentes de una forma de pensar que se llama tecnoliberalismo.
Thinker, author, and agent provocateur, Peter Thiel, from Fiesole, Italy, uncommon knowledge now. Things slow down. In the last quarter century, economic growth in the United States has slowed. Real wages have remained, for the most part, stagnant. Moore's law, that computing power per dollar would effectively double every 18 months, hasn't applied for years. Instead, we've got a kind of parody of Moore's law, Eroom's law, which is Moore spelled backwards, that the price of a new biotech drug doubles every 7 years. And in field after field, even theoretical progress seems to have slowed. Physics in the last 50 years, nothing like the enormous creativity of the first half of the 20th century. From Einstein's general relativity in 1916 to putting a man on the moon in 1969, just over half a century. The last time we put a man on the moon, half a century ago. Peter Thiel, we were promised flying cars, and all we got was 140 characters. What has happened?
Well, I think you just gave a very good summary of what happened. That somehow we had this sort of multifaceted, multidimensional progress in the first half of the 20th century, where if you define technology in the late 1960s, it would have meant rockets and aerospace and the green revolution in agriculture and computers and new medicines and all sorts of things. Whereas today, maybe the last quarter century, the world technology is synonymous with information technology, which is that we've had some continued progress in this world of bits, internet, computers, mobile internet. Maybe even that's slowed over the last decade, or has at least become much less charismatic. But there has been sort of this generalized sense of stagnation. It's always quite a complicated thing to talk about, because you have to sort of evaluate all these different things. So, how do you weight the smoothness of your iPhone versus the lack of a flying car?
Right.
How do you sort of measure and quantify all these things? I think the difficulty of quantifying it is one of the reasons that we've not talked about it enough, and that it has taken us so long to figure out that we've actually been stuck. That we think we've been in enchanted a forest, but we've been wandering in the desert for 40 or 50 years or something like that.
So since you raise it, how do you handle the counter-argument, which is perfectly straightforward? Look, progress takes place in fits and starts. It's not smooth and continuous in every field. It jumps around. And we have had a communications revolution, which in this period of time we've gone, well, we didn't get flying cars, but we did get Dick Tracy watches. We did get iPhones. We have got an internet, which means that we here in Italy are connected. You get the picture. That's the counter-argument.
Well, again, I think the challenge is to somehow try to quantify over all these things. How big are they? How significant are they? And I would say on the level of the politics, the culture, the macroeconomics, there is this profound sense of stagnation. There's this profound sense that the younger generation will not do better than their parents. There's some kind of generational compact that's been broken. We still have progressivism in politics. We still have it as a word, but it's sort of, we don't have it in anything else in our society. And then I think even, I think the computer internet revolution was the one big exception. And it is striking how uncharismatic that has become over the last 6 or 7 years, where even in San Francisco or Silicon Valley, the felt sense is that most people are somehow being left behind. That it's not this utopian, inclusive future at all.
Pues parece que una de las preocupaciones que se pone sobre la mesa es si la emergencia del Internet, o sea, si su surgimiento sea lo único que se ha desarrollado de una forma tan agresiva en las últimas décadas, 2-3 décadas, digamos en el inicio del siglo XXI. Porque parecía que al ritmo al que iban las cosas íbamos a terminar, por ejemplo, viendo en la especulación de la película de Volver al Futuro, ¿no? Carros voladores, las patinetas de Martin McFly, o al menos esa era una especulación de un futuro que se pensaba que se podía lograr. Algunas de estas cosas son fantasiosas, pero yo incluso podría apuntar hacia el secularismo, que es el que atonta la creatividad de las personas. El apartarse de Dios pues hace que las personas generen ciencia basada en engaños, como si la humanidad hubiera entrado en una etapa de oscuridad por basar su ciencia en falsedades. Pero eso no significa que haya gente que haya renunciado a por ejemplo, explorar las bondades de las matemáticas y la programación. Y incluso aunque sean personas agnósticas, de todas maneras buscan la lógica detrás de las cosas. Por eso, por ejemplo, ahora los modelos de lenguaje pues funcionan porque utilizan algoritmos basados en lógica. Así que podríamos apuntar hacia el secularismo como una de las razones del estancamiento, sí, como estos movimientos políticos que están jalando a las personas a apartarse de Dios.
Again, I'm quoting you. This is something you mentioned just the other day. There's a sense that science and tech are a trap that humanity is setting for itself.
Well, there's always a question, why the slowdown has happened, and I'm always hesitant to answer the why question because these things are so overdetermined, and it can be things from sclerosis and overregulation in government to ways that education institutions have deranged. It's possible that in certain areas it's just become harder to discover new things. Where even if we build new particle colliders in physics, how many new particles are we finding? And so there sort of are a whole range of components to it. But if I had to anchor on a single narrative, the one that I've come to believe very strongly is that there's something about science and technology that is very dangerous, that feels somewhat like a trap, where so many of these technologies have sort of a very dark, violent, even apocalyptic dimension. The paradigmatic example are probably nuclear weapons, where progress didn't stop immediately after 1945, but it was some kind of a delayed quarter-century reaction where, say, in 1970, people woke up one day and realized, we can blow the whole world up, 20 times over. We're sending people to the moon to build these ICBMs to send the thermonuclear bombs to the Soviet Union even faster. And at some point, what's the point? And then I think what happened with nuclear technology is true of so many other areas. There's a question about AI. Is this a fundamentally dangerous apocalyptic technology? There's a left-wing version of this with climate change, but maybe you can generalize this to various other forms of environmental degradation. There is, polemically, I've often suggested, we should have a ticker tape parade for the scientists who invented the mRNA vaccine, which is again an impressive breakthrough in biotech. And I think we're uncomfortable giving them a ticker tape parade because immediately adjacent to the mRNA vaccine is we're immediately reminded as we have that ticker tape parade, or if we were to have it, of the sort of gain-of-function research that was being conducted at the Wuhan lab, and sort of this Orwellian word maybe for a bioweapons program. And so all these things are deeply adjacent.
So the notion is that every one of these technological and scientific advances that we used to be so thrilled about, every one of them is a double-edged sword.
It's at least double-edged. Now, it doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing them. I'm still on the.
Entonces él dice que por cada descubrimiento científico existe la posibilidad de que el hallazgo se vuelva en algo destructivo y apocalíptico para la humanidad. Yo estoy ahorita investigando los fundamentos del valor intrínseco y lo que me planteo es la adopción de qué pasaría si Cristo vuelve para restaurar todas las cosas. O sea, yo asumiendo la veracidad del Evangelio, que Cristo se levantó de entre los muertos y ahora vivimos en este mundo llenos del Espíritu Santo. Entonces, Pablo, en la primera carta a los Corintios, capítulo 13, verso 13, dice que lo único que va a trascender es la fe, la esperanza y el amor, que son las virtudes teologales, el amor visto como caridad. Entonces yo pienso que cada acción que hacemos le vamos a rendir cuentas a Cristo y le importa a Él todo lo que hacemos, desde barrer o en este caso hacer un software o un cohete o una bomba nuclear. Entonces no creo que Dios no le guste que estemos haciendo investigación científica, pero una de las formas en las que adquiere valor intrínseco es quizás preguntándote, ¿esto que estamos haciendo va a ser utilizado en la Jerusalén celestial? ¿O es algo que yo pudiera traer a los pies de Cristo? O sea, ya poniéndole una dimensión moral ética a lo que tú estás haciendo, no creo que hubiera impedimentos para encontrar usos, por ejemplo, de la energía atómica o de la energía nuclear. O cualquier innovación científica, médica, O sea, yo pienso que aquí él está hablando de un problema moral y la falta de una moral cristiana genera todo tipo de riesgos de generar algo que fuera muy destructivo para la humanidad. Por ejemplo, ahora que estuve estudiando la riqueza de las naciones, uno de las declaraciones de Adam Smith es: la riqueza de las naciones se basa en la capacidad de hacer comercio de las naciones. Y yo pienso que está incompleta porque esa está basada en visiones materialistas. Más bien debería ser que la riqueza de las naciones está basada en su capacidad de hacer el bien al prójimo. O sea, si tú, en lugar de tener motivos egoístas, lo haces como para servir a Cristo, pensando que el prójimo es Cristo, entonces eso define muchas cosas. Podría definir desde las situaciones más simples de trabajo hasta las empresas más grandes, porque ya no estaríamos hablando de una capitalización con el fin de acumular por acumular, que ese sería como el capitalismo, como acumular posesiones para tener más poder y hacer más influencia. Más bien estaríamos buscando la redención de todas las cosas, que si el algoritmo de negocios que acabamos de diseñar o que está sirviendo a las personas eh, pudiera hacerse más grande y multiplicarse para ayudar a más personas. Creo que esa es la base, por ejemplo, de esto que propongo, que es articular el valor intrínseco en torno a la fe, la esperanza y la caridad. O sea, cuando digo, la pregunta es: ¿esto podrá ser adoptado en la Jerusalén celestial por Cristo? Este producto que estamos haciendo, eso me empieza a definir el producto que estás trayendo a la mesa, ¿no? A pesar de que solamente veas las situaciones físicas reales o materiales, pero no estás viendo el resto de la realidad que tiene que ver con la adopción de estos productos y sus principios al cielo, ¿no? O sea, que en lugar de que hagas las cosas para engañar a alguien o explotar, pues estás creando un producto basado en la verdad. Y creo que eso puede generar un montón de espacio para la innovación tecnológica y que podamos salir de pues de esta trampa de la que están describiendo.
Accelerationist camp. I'm still on the deregulation side. I'm still, I still think it's a catastrophe that these things have slowed down. But it's not simply a failure. It's also, it's also what people have done because, the alternatives were quite dangerous and quite frightening. I would like there to be, we've made very little progress in cancer research. I'd like there to be more progress in biotech. But maybe if we'd had a lot of progress, there would have been some dangers with that, and people were very, very scared of those dangers. So
yo pienso que todos los esfuerzos de investigación deben estar alineados a estos tres virtudes teologales. Y creo que en cuanto haces eso, las piezas encajan. O sea, si no ha habido mucho progreso, por ejemplo, en la investigación por el cáncer, probablemente proviene de premisas falsas. Y en cuanto encajan las piezas de las premisas verdaderas, debe desenvolverse el secreto.
There's a nuclear power plant debate in Germany. Why did they shut down the nuclear power plants? It's the dumbest thing ever. But so many of these nuclear power plants, are dual use. You create plutonium and then you can build bombs, and it's not that easy to separate the civilian from military uses.
Right. So the idea here is we've slowed down for all kinds of little reasons that we can see, increase in regulation, this, that, fine. But there's a deep reason, almost at the level of the reptile brain, something so deep that we don't often talk about it and aren't often perhaps even conscious of it. Tech and science is frightening. So we're just as happy to have it slow down.
If you look at, I used to, as a teenager, I used to love science fiction. I haven't read much science fiction in decades because it's all just dystopian and depressing. Yeah. And maybe that's some reflection of our culture, but maybe it is also telling us something about the logic of science and technology that so many of the paths to the future are extremely dangerous.
Pero justo es eso, ¿no? Como esta cultura de hacer pensar que la tecnología va a la distopia, cuando podría hacerse una tecnología para al servicio del humano. O sea, es una tecnología cristiana, ¿no? Que sirva al prójimo para traer vida, no muerte. Y justo creo que puede ser que este secularismo esté infectando a lo que hablamos, por ejemplo, o sea, incluso podría gente utilizar la imaginación para crear mundos más interesantes que el distópico o el apocalíptico de la destrucción, ¿no?
If you had a warp drive like they have in Star Trek, could you send weapons at warp speed and then they would hit you faster than the speed of light, and you wouldn't even see them before they hit you. And so there are all these sort of plot holes in the original Star Trek universe that over time people figured out.
We'll come back to that.
¿Ves? Porque si partes, por ejemplo, haciendo tecnología pensando en Star Trek, pues puede ser que ahí estés mirando en los lugares incorrectos de donde deberíamos estar desarrollando tecnología. O sea, ya se convierte en un problema teológico incluso.
China. The late foreign policy analyst Henry Rowan, writing in 1996, that year is important, 1996, quote, "When will China become a democracy? The answer is around the year 2015. This prediction is based on China's steady and impressive economic growth, which in turn fits the pattern of the way in which freedom has grown in Asia and elsewhere in the world," close quote. First economic growth, then democracy. Not a crazy suggestion. It worked in South Korea, and then it worked in Taiwan. But of course, the prediction that China would become a democracy in 2015 today looks preposterous. Why didn't it work in China?
It's again, why questions are always hard to answer. It's one cut I always have on China was that they learned from the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and they were going to have perestroika without glasnost. They were going to have a certain liberalization of the economy without becoming a sort of free and open society. There certainly were a lot of indications well before 2015 that it wasn't quite trending that way. You had a great firewall around China where the big U.S. internet companies didn't have any effective presence in China. 2010, 2005, 2000, it was pretty effectively walled off. And if you ask people in Silicon Valley circa 2005 or 2010, there was still some Fukuyama inevitability law that China would have to open up to the U.S. tech companies. It wasn't obvious why that was true, even in 2005 or 2010. But I think somehow there's always a question how much of these things are personal or structural. So there's a personal version where you can say that there's something unusually crazy about Xi, that he's the second coming of Stalin or Genghis Khan or something like this. And then there's maybe it's not personal to Xi. Maybe it's just structural, that China could be moderately free, not completely totalitarian, as long as the economy was growing 8% a year. And at the point when that slowed down, and all exponential things eventually slow, you had to actually clamp down a lot more. That once China grows at 3 or 4% a year, and the growth is uneven, it's actually going to become more authoritarian, more totalitarian, something like that.
Let me try two quotations on you here. The historian Stephen Kotkin, whom you know, when asked to name his main finding after a lifetime of studying in the Soviet archives, quote, "They were communists," close quote. President Xi Jinping of China, he's speaking to the Central Committee in 2013. This is a speech the Chinese republished in 2019, and that, as far as I can tell from looking at the internet, American analysts discovered in 2020. Xi Jinping in 2013 to the Central Committee. "There are people who believe that communism is an unattainable hope, but facts have repeatedly told us that Marx and Engels' analysis is not outdated. Capitalism is bound to die out." Close.
Ven, ahí es, por ejemplo, donde también pienso que China tiene este error fundamental de aferrarse a Marx, cuando Marx basa su doctrina en materialismo, ¿sí? O sea, y su visión del hombre, que él piensa que éramos changuitos. Entonces, ya cuando empiezas con todo este tema fundamentalmente erróneo, pues, o sea, no significa que, por ejemplo, para abrir una empresa necesitas pensar en Marx, ¿no? O sea, hay ciertas cosas que no necesitan la ideología de Marx, pero el problema empieza a generarse cuando se exige que seas creativo. Y China no ha podido desarrollar una creatividad pues sólida más que copiar lo que hay en otro lado. Eso no significa que no haya potencial, que no haya prójimos. Es el país más poblado, más de 1,000 millones de personas, ¿no? Y todos ellos necesitan servicios, todos ellos tienen necesidades y deseos, Pero cuando sometes a personas a regímenes tan imperfectos como el marxista, pues es lógico que llegue un punto donde te encuentres estos obstáculos por los que actualmente está atravesando China, ¿no?
Close quote. So, in the conflict with China, to what extent are we facing just another great power struggle? But this was always the question with the Soviet Union, right? Oh, it's just another great... No, it isn't. They're different because they're communists. Same question for China.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We need to take it more seriously at face value.
Right.
They say they're communist. We should just take that very.
Why argue with them?
We should take that at least at face value. There probably are a lot of sub questions one can ask. So maybe they're not strictly Marxist, but they are strictly Leninist, and so it is sort of this totalitarian one-party structure. Maybe there are elements of it that are also fascist, where the Prague Spring was communism with the human face, and maybe China is fascism with a communist face, or something like that. And then, of course, there are some ways in which it's also different from fascism and communism in the early 20th century forms, where both fascism and communism were fundamentally youth movements, and then China is kind of a gerontocracy, and so it is
distinctive.
So it's sort of a half fascist, half communist gerontocracy. It's strangely much less idealistic or ideological, I think, than the Soviet Union. It strikes me that people probably don't really believe in any of these ideas. They have to sort of be forced down in a very strange way. So there's certainly a lot of things that are unique and different, but yeah, taking it as a communist country at face value, we could do much worse than that.
Okay.
Ahora, una de las cosas es que por mucho que un partido, por ejemplo, como el comunista, controle la vida de los chinos, no significa que todos estén de acuerdo con eso. Simplemente la manera en la que funciona ese régimen tiene esas implicaciones, por ejemplo, de quererlo controlar todo. Pero no es que los chinos estén de acuerdo con eso. Yo he estado en China y pues muchos de ellos, aunque están convencidos de que ese lugar en donde viven es el mejor posible, pero ven circunstancias que se dan cuenta que podrían ser mejor sus vidas. Entonces, también ahí está creciendo la fe cristiana en China, a pesar de que el Partido Comunista está todavía oponiendo resistencia. Entonces, pienso que ese desencanto de la vida proviene incluso de mantenerse en esta convicción de apartarse de Dios, de atea. Pero a medida que la población china está adoptando el cristianismo, creo que también existe esta esperanza de que vuelva la fe en todo. O sea, justo cuando tú aplicas fe, esperanza y caridad, pues este modelo no es independiente del modelo económico que haya donde tú estás viviendo, porque entonces cada acción que tú haces está sirviendo a Dios y a Dios le importa.
Grand strategy. Since at least the Civil War, the United States has relied on superior materiel. Grant just ground down Lee. During the Second World War, we produced thousands of planes and tanks and ships. The Kaiser shipyard in Oakland was producing a ship a day. That won't work against China. We can't outproduce them. We can't outspend them. Our only hope, goes the argument, is to out-innovate them. I've even heard the historian Andrew Roberts say that the future of civilization will be decided in Silicon Valley. So, on the one hand, in the coming conflict with China, we need innovation, goes at least one argument that I find compelling. But we ourselves, to some extent, as you just were suggesting, have locked down innovation. This is a serious pickle.
Pero justo creo que parte del problema que están enfrentando es por partir de premisas falsas cuando están planteando temas de innovación. Si Cristo es el logos, Él es la base de la lógica, y apartarte de Cristo pues solo puede llevar a la irrelevancia y a la necedad, ¿no? Es darle vueltas como a las mismas cosas apartado de Cristo. Por eso esa ciencia no está produciendo nada. Y tampoco los chinos están produciendo nada por lo mismo que están apartados de Cristo. Entonces yo pienso que el futuro de la civilización no depende de Silicon Valley en ese sentido, porque, por ejemplo, vean, la innovación tecnológica de las fintech mexicanas, todas se basan en hacer más fáciles los pagos, ¿no? Como que todos se centraron en las mismas cosas y son totalmente aburridas e irrelevantes y no están llevando a nada. Y ahora, obviamente para innovar, pues es muy difícil, por ejemplo, hacerlo en una ciudad pequeña como Durango, donde es muy difícil encontrar pares porque la gente que podría ser tu par está pensando en otras cosas, no está pensando en la innovación. Entonces sí es obvio que tengas que ir y buscar ciertos lugares donde puedas encontrarte con personas que también quisieran llevar a cabo la innovación de muchos de los campos, pero insisto, no creo que depende más de las premisas y es donde yo estoy como poniendo sobre la mesa que si se combinan estos conceptos de fe, esperanza y caridad en el desarrollo tecnológico, se puede avanzar sin depender de un punto geográfico específico. Y esto lo estoy diciendo muy en serio. O sea, si se pudieran aplicar estos principios para cualquier campo de biotecnología, de esto que está diciendo.
Yeah, I mean, I think there sort of are a lot of different ways one can describe it. I worry that if you frame it simply as a conflict between the United States and China, that is almost self-defeating. Where probably China has 4 times the population, so we would have to really out-innovate them, and we have to really block them from stealing any of our innovations to win a conflict where it's that lopsided, 4-1 on population. Probably a big part of the question of the next few decades is sort of how does the strategic map of the world shape up, and maybe China can beat the U.S., but it probably can't beat the whole world. And there is sort of a question whether there's something about the communism in China, which is it's nationalistic. It's a socialism. It's a socialism of a nationalistic sort,
right?
And it's extremely racist. It's extremely xenophobic. And there's something about that where I don't think they'll be able to beat the whole world.
Okay, so in the shape of the conflict, it is correct to identify China as the adversary. China is the enemy. But it's not just the United States. We really have no choice. We have to think in terms of the West, or in terms of as many allies as we can stitch together. How do you describe it?
I think they're both unilateral and multilateral moves. I think the Trump administration was correct that you had to try to do things unilaterally because the multilateral approaches were too slow. I think the Biden administration is correct that at some point, you also have to try to do things more multilaterally. But I think that,
o sea, más bien yo lo veo en términos de que es cristianismo respecto al mundo. O sea, es Cristo frente al mundo. O sea, y no estoy diciendo que Estados Unidos representa a Cristo, pero es una cultura más cristiana que la China, por ejemplo, ¿no? Y en el caso de China, el evangelio está metiéndose a través de las fracturas del sistema chino, pero es muy difícil. O sea, si el valor intrínseco tiene que ver con la capacidad de hacer el bien, basados en estos temas de fe, esperanza y caridad que son trascendentes a el materialismo, pues imagínate cómo sería una sociedad donde no existieran estos elementos y todo estuviera enfocado en el materialismo. O sea, y no estoy diciendo que Estados Unidos no adolece del problema del materialismo, ellos lo ven del otro punto de vista de la codicia de alguien que quiere tener más y más y más, ¿no? Este hombre es un tecnócrata, él está detrás de Elon Musk, por ejemplo, ahorita en Estados Unidos. Y Elon Musk con sus teorías está aplicando en este momento ese programa DOGE, ¿no? Para hacer recortes en la burocracia estadounidense. Justo también desde un punto de vista materialista, y creo que esa es parte como de lo que puede llevar al colapso de Estados Unidos, porque abandonan estos temas de fe, esperanza y caridad. A medida que la iglesia cristiana crezca en China, puede haber fe, esperanza y amor en las acciones que haga este país. Y podría beneficiarse el mundo también. Está interesante.
There is some kind of a logic to this, and if you look at the Ukraine conflict with Russia, there's obviously was this incredible mistake that Western Europe made to entangle itself so tightly with Russia, with the pipelines, with the denuclearization in Germany, and then the question you have to ask is, aren't we just too entangled with China in the entire Western world? I believe in free trade. I'm not in favor of tariffs, but I would make an exception for our one massive geopolitical and ideological rival.
All right. Our home state, California. Your native state, my home state now. The resource curse. I'm just going to quote from Wikipedia. Here's the resource curse. The resource curse is the phenomenon of countries with an abundance of natural resources, such as fossil fuels, having less economic growth, less democracy, or worse development outcomes than countries with fewer resources. Close quote. You spoke recently at the National Conservatism Conference in Miami, I think, about the resource curse in California. Explain that.
Well, if we say that tech is the oil of the 21st century, there is this strange juxtaposition where California has been, it has these gusher-like companies that just generate, enormous wealth, enormous profits, a decent number of quite well-paying jobs, and then they're combined with this, rather bad form of social political governance where you'd never do anything like this. And it's that juxtaposition I was trying to make sense of. There's like a San Francisco version of it where it's, on a per capita GDP, it has to be one of the wealthiest cities in the world, and then it's completely misgoverned. And somehow these things are, it's not a paradox, but these things are actually deeply connected.
So you made the point.
But the one thing I would quibble with on the definition is California is not poor. It's still
fantastically.
It's 40 million people in California. It's 82 million in Germany, 125 million in Japan. Today, the California GDP is roughly the same as Germany or Japan. The average person in California makes twice as much money as the average person in Germany, 3 times as much as the average person in Japan. So there's something about it that's worked quite well from a macroeconomic point of view, and then it's worked catastrophically from a governance point of view. With public schools that don't work, all these sort of government worker rackets.
You mentioned a couple of, it's worked quite well. It's worked historically well. There's never been any.
Bueno, este hombre también tiene el problema del materialismo, igual como el de China marxista. Este hombre es materialista desde el punto de vista liberal, ¿no? Entonces, los dos son errores garrafales porque solo estás viendo la dimensión de lo que crees que es la realidad, lo material, ¿no? Pero no estás viendo el tema trascendental. Y es inevitable porque justo por eso él habla de problemas y dolores y cosas como el deber ser, ¿verdad? Que ya tienen que ver con lo positivo metafísico.
Governance is inflated real estate values. Explain how that works.
You have to think of it as the curse of an oil state or a tech state as you have this enormous gusher of wealth, and then it gets redistributed very inefficiently. And one inefficient vehicle is towards overpaid government workers. The average California government worker gets paid twice as much as the average private sector worker in California. It's by far the highest ratio in the U.S. In Texas, Florida, the average government worker gets paid 10-15% more than the average private sector worker. In California, it's twice as much, including the very generous retirement benefits they get. And then the second way that the tech wealth gets very inefficiently redistributed is through all these sort of crazy zoning laws where, if you're living in San Francisco or Silicon Valley, you're not in the tech industry, but, you're a landlord who bought some apartment and you make sure the zoning laws never get changed, nothing new ever gets built, and, enormous amount gets shifted into the sort of, very quasi-governmental real estate sector.
Overall, the cost of living in California is some 40% higher than in the rest of the nation, and the cost of real estate is 100% higher. What does that mean? Once again, I'm quoting you. Basically, you have to replace the middle class.
O sea, me llama la atención que él, justo en su ideología, trata de decir todos los puntos que son opuestos o sea, en su ideología, él, por ejemplo, se presenta en contra de la burocracia, ¿no? Diciendo que es más eficiente tener menos empleados y critica eso como si esa fuera la fuente de la desigualdad en California, ¿no?
Meaning, they just move out?
Sure. There was, I believe it was Carol Quigley, the Georgetown historian, who circa 1960 said that the Republicans are the party of the middle class, the Democrats are the party of everybody else. And probably the most middle-class constituency left in California are government workers. And if you think of teachers or people like that as not natural Republican voters, if that's the microeconomic or political economy of California is something like that, it's no wonder that it's a D+30 state. It's not. I mean, it shouldn't be surprising at all.
Right. So this brings us to politics. You argue that the Golden State poses a problem for each of the two parties, Democrats and Republicans. Democrats first, quoting you. On the Democratic side, my read is that the Democrats, have no alternative but to somehow pretend they can make the California model work for the country as a whole, but it won't.
It's just like, if you were to say, I don't know, I'll go back to the Saudi Arabia analogy. If you were to say the Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia is the key to solving all the problems throughout the Islamic world, they just need to be like Saudi Arabia. That's preposterous because it's not the Wahhabi ideology, it's the oil money.
Right.
And in a similar way, if it's somebody like...
Ben es materialista, él dice, no es el tema de la ideología, es el dinero. Y ahorita va a decir de California es el dinero, los recursos, cuando es claramente un problema ideológico el que está sufriendo California por el wokismo.
Like, I don't know, Newsom or Kamala Harris saying that it's some hyper woke identity politics, political correctness to the nth degree. That's not what makes California successful. It's the big tech companies. They're at the scale that they're at. You can't scale them by a factor of 8 to the country as a whole. So it doesn't scale.
The leading Democratic presidential...
Sí, no escala porque él es materialista, pero las razones por las que está ahí concentrados todos estos capitales es por la creatividad, y la creatividad es de orden metafísico. O sea, eso es de orden trascendente. Y si organizáramos humanos que estuvieran alineados al orden trascendente, habría creatividad en muchas partes del mundo. Porque no es que unos humanos sean más que los demás por ciertas condiciones. Menos ahora, por ejemplo, con el tema de la disponibilidad de conocimiento por medio de la inteligencia artificial.
Candidates unpredicted as we speak. You've got Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom. Quoting Peter Thiel, California is strong enough to crush everybody else in the Democratic Party. You're assuming that Joe Biden won't run. Mm-hmm. Right. California is strong enough to crush everybody else in the Democratic Party, which means you've got two Californians on top, Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom. But it's probably not strong enough to be a very compelling agenda for the country as a whole.
Yeah, you've just articulated my whole argument. I don't have much to add to that, but I think, yes.
Let's stop that.
I think the alternatives to California, if we were to enumerate them, it is something like, it is Elizabeth Warren, the crazed university professor who is like a bad Puritan minister from the 17th century. That's not going to work. It is, it's Tim Ryan, the fake blue collar guy from Ohio, where no one cares about blue collar workers. So there's a Midwestern thing that's not going to work. There's probably, some kind of crazed socialist thing, a la Bernie Sanders or AOC. That's dead on arrival. And so, yes, there's some sense in which California is working the best, and so it will beat everything within the Democratic Party. And then my speculative predictions, when you get to the country as a whole, it will be found shockingly wanting.
I'm quoting you once again, probably the temptation on the Republican side is that they'll think it's good enough to say simply that they're not California. This nihilistic negation is probably not enough.
Well, let's qualify
that again. But in the younger generation, Ross Douthat has this phrase that he keeps using, zombie Reaganism. So I hear that and I say, of course, principles have to be adapted to the issues of the day, but is there an extent to which the rising generation on the right and center right is just sick of hearing about Ronald Reagan, the way Democrats in the 60s got sick of hearing about FDR? Is it purely generational?
Depends on other countries working with us. Part of it will be helped by China just going completely berserk internally, and so I'm not sure that the exact same formula will work.
Okay, so we do first what we know how to do.
But look, I'm quite open. I don't know exactly what you're supposed to do in terms of having a more concrete agenda.
I thought you were going to. I have a blank page here where you were going to fill it in.
I think we have to look. I think I always think the right broadly is it's a very ragtag rebel alliance. It's like we have diversity on our side. It's like Star Wars. It's Chewbacca and Princess Leia, and we have some Asperger-like C-3PO people.
The Rebel Alliance.
And Han Solo. It's the Rebel Alliance, and the other side is in lockstep. They're the Imperial Stormtroopers. And
two quotations. Notre Dame political scientist Patrick Deneen, quote, "Liberalism has failed." He's speaking here of classical liberalism, the liberalism of individual liberty. "Liberalism has failed, not because it fell short, but because it was true to itself. It has failed because it has succeeded. The founders failed to foresee that their atomistic philosophy would act as a solvent on our civic institutions." That's quotation one. Here's quotation two. Author George Will. "The proper question for conservatives, what do you seek to conserve? The proper answer? We seek to conserve the American founding." George Will, let's get back to the founding principles. Patrick Deneen, let's refound the country. Let's overturn the original founding.
They both strike me as a little bit too abstract. There's things about them that sound correct as observations or critiques, but how to concretize it, I don't know how we go back to the founding. If there's going to be a new founding, that's even more, ambitious.
Do you like the majority of 6 conservatives or originalists on the Supreme Court?
Sure, but mostly they're mostly just keeping things the status quo the way it is. So it's it's better than the alternative. Look, Deneen is right that in some sense classical liberalism has failed. I always like to say that a classical liberal in 2022 is like a Marxist prof in 1982, where these profs who 40 years ago were saying, true communism has never been tried, and it's equally wrong when the classical liberals in 2022 say that true liberalism has never been tried, and there's some kind of a golden age we can go back to, and even if we did, wouldn't we just cycle and repeat it? And it would just, if we went back to the 50s, we'd get 68 again, and so there was something wrong in the 50s, or there was something wrong with the founding if it went this wrong. So that's why I'm more on the Deneen side than the George Will side.
Bueno, hay una observación que yo tengo, qué bueno que apareció Adam Smith, por ejemplo, para enunciar sus teorías que luego se popularizaron y luego algunos gobiernos adoptaron para generar sus políticas. Pero digamos, en la escala enorme de las cosas, muchas cosas ya estaban ocurriendo sin la existencia de Adam Smith y también sin la existencia de Marx. Digo, no estoy diciendo que los políticos no adoptaron sus libros o sus ideologías para hacer sus políticas nuevamente, pero como que la vida sigue avanzando, pues, sin necesidad de muchas de estas teorías. Como que la gente sigue produciendo, la gente se sigue poniendo de acuerdo para hacer negocios, o el comercio, o para que la vida siga, para que las personas puedan solventar sus necesidades. Entonces, en este mismo sentido, creo que por ahí va el comentario de Peter Thiel de siempre va a estar por el otro lado este tema de que es que no se ha aplicado a cabalidad la ideología.
I do think...
I heard you the other day, you said that we now find ourselves between Scylla and Charybdis. Greek mythology, narrow, straight. Scylla is a 6-headed monster over here, and Charybdis is a whirlpool over here. And in Greek myth, you had to navigate between these two, each of which was deadly. You described our Scylla and Charybdis. Actually, here's what you said in a recent paper that you wrote. The stable deterrence structures of the Cold War look much shakier as more countries acquire nuclear weapons. It seems far easier now than at any time since World War II to sleepwalk into an all-out conflict. So the prospect of Armageddon, let's call that Scylla. And here's Charybdis, an endless stagnation. I'm quoting from the same paper. We have grown attached to our soft, comfortable ways, but we do not want to name what they are protecting against. How bad is the Scylla, the prospect of Armageddon?
Well, the thing I would say that's always nuanced and complicated is that it's quite bad, but we have to also weight it against the alternative. And
yes.
The extreme alternative is is the sort of soft totalitarianism, a society that simply is locked down where nothing happens. If you were to use the biblical terminology, it's the Antichrist, the one world totalitarian state, and there's always a sense where I think we should be at least as scared of the Antichrist as of Armageddon, and then certainly my contrarian intuition is that people are far more worried about Armageddon than they are worried about the one world state, and I would at least like us to worry about them equally, to worry both about Scylla and Charybdis.
Okay.
O sea, vean cómo al final la conversación deriva en un tema teológico.
So, elaborate a little bit.
I there are all these different versions. There's a recent paper by
the Armageddon we sort of talked about at the opening. Well, the Armageddon is we pursue science and we pursue technology, and it could all blow up in a nuclear war.
And then let's right? Elaborate it.
Yes.
So if you don't pursue, if we're going to stop that, you can't just stop it locally. You have to stop it globally. You have to make sure that all scientists stop it. You have to make sure that they're being policed all over the world. And if there's some small piece of computer code that can lead to a runaway AGI, we need to have surveillance technology installed on every single laptop to make sure that people aren't typing in keystrokes to code up the AGI that's going to destroy the world. Or if you can, the nuclear weapons issue already from the 50s and 60s, what came with this multinational atomic energy agency that was going to international atomic energy agency that was going to sort of monitor all these countries, and you needed a supranational structure with real teeth.
Miren cómo es el problema del ego tan grande como de querer ser controlador de todas las cosas.
And in practice, we ended up with something in between. We ended up with some kind of global superstate. It wasn't never quite that much. It was maybe not quite enough to fully stop Armageddon. It was never quite enough to be totalitarian. But those have been the bad alternatives for 77 years, and we need to find some way in between.
Okay, and the lockdown. We fear Armageddon too much.
We only talk about it strikes me we almost only talk about the Armageddon stuff, and we never talk about the sort of regulatory political lockdown. That's the practical alternative where everyone's just scared of their own shadow.
So if we put it, I'm trying to bring growth back into
Me
this.
parece que la única solución es el Evangelio, navegar esto a través del Evangelio de Jesucristo.
Growth, to pursue growth, means in one way or another to have the courage to risk a certain degree of new innovation. We unleash technology and science again to produce growth, correct?
Yes.
All right. So, and why do you and I, because we have known each other a long time and think alike in some pretty basic ways, we both say growth and assume that that's a good. But let's make that explicit. Why do we need growth? What does that do for American society? And why is what happens, or the other way around, what happens to us in the absence of growth?
Well, we had, the Club of Rome wrote this book called The Limits to Growth in 1972, almost exactly 50 years ago. And it basically said that, the growth couldn't continue, and so we had to get used to a zero growth world. First, a world of zero population growth, then a world of zero economic growth. And there are all these ways that their agenda broadly has been implemented over the last 50 years. And it has, in some ways, perhaps it's stabilized the world, but it's also been profoundly destabilizing it's led to a world that's extremely nihilistic. It's led to the sort of cultural disintegration of the middle class, where you think of the middle class as the people who think their children will do better than themselves. And there's sort of all these ways the zero growth world hasn't worked out that well. And so yes, my intuition is that it's not simply stable. This is where I disagree with Dow, that it's not simply decadent or simply stable. It's not simply entropic. It's ultimately, there's ultimately a catastrophe on both sides.
So,
and there's an Armageddon catastrophe if you have unconstrained tech and science where no one's paying attention and people are just pushing buttons and seeing what happens. But there's also always a risk of a centralizing totalitarian catastrophe on the other side, which is the natural solution on how do you stop all science and tech? Is you need a one world state with real teeth,
which is within our grasp, the humanity's grasp, as AI emerges.
Well, it's an answer to the nuclear problem. It's an answer to the environmental challenges. It's an answer to the AI challenges, and I would just submit it's
in this. If this is the moment in which we find ourselves, there's Armageddon, and there's stagnation and creeping world government. And they're there. We have no choice but to be courageous. Can there be something ennobling about this? Can we pull ourselves together again?
Well,
Can we feel adventurous?
Well, it is certainly something like this frame is correct. It matters what we do. It's a world in which, yeah, we need courage. We need some kind of agency. The choices we make really matter. I don't think, yes, Armageddon and the world government are exclusionary possibilities. They're not exhaustive. I do think there's some narrow or not terribly broad way in between, but
there's a way.
But there's a way, and there's a lot for us to do there.
It matters what we do.
Yeah, obviously it matters a lot.
Peter Thiel, thank you.
Bueno, justo ahí es donde creo que cabe perfectamente el camino que nos alumbra a Cristo con fe, esperanza y amor en todo lo que hacemos. Creo que de ahí puede surgir la creatividad que estamos esperando, porque si tú haces las cosas con fe, esperanza y amor, pues puedes avanzar hacia adelante. O sea, la esperanza de que Cristo nos está acompañando y que Él quiere lo mejor para la humanidad. Y además estamos yendo a un camino trascendente, no nada más importa lo que haces en este momento, sino que a Cristo le importa y puede ser adoptado por Cristo para la eternidad. Entonces, qué conversación tan interesante, me llevó un montón de puntos y bueno, muchas gracias por escucharme.